Imagine a king who cast himself over an entire nation, a figure whose will was law, whose word could command life or death, and whose power reshaped the course of history itself. This was King Henry VIII, a monarch whose name conjures both grandeur and terror. Yet, even the most formidable rulers are not immune to the fragility of their mortal forms. By the final years of his reign, Henry VIII became a grotesque spectacle, a king rotting alive, trapped in a body that betrayed him while his mind and authority struggled to maintain control. The story of the rotten king alive is not merely a tale of morbidity. It is a lens into Tudor history, into the intertwining of human ambition, political mastery, and the limits of medieval medicine gone wrong. Over the course of this narrative, we will uncover not just the physical horrors of Henry's decline, but also the cascading effects on governance, succession, and culture. We will explore how a monarch, once the epitome of vitality and authority, became a living cautionary tale, a striking reminder that even a crown encrusted with jewels cannot shield a man from the inevitability of decay. Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, inheriting a kingdom fraught with tension yet ripe with opportunity. The early years of his reign were marked by triumph and brilliance. He was young, handsome, and intelligent, a medieval king whose charisma inspired both admiration and fear. His court at Hampton Court Palace and Whitehall shimmered with opulence, gilded ceilings, tapestries depicting heroic battles, and a constant display of wealth and culture that projected the king's dominance over his realm. In these halls, Henry's power was absolute. Laws were made and broken at his whim. Nobles were elevated or executed based on his favor, and the machinery of the monarchy moved like a well-oiled engine under his command. Yet, beneath the veneer of vigor and triumph lay the seeds of what would become one of history's most bizarre cases, a king whose body would fail him spectacularly. Henry VIII's final days were not only a medical tragedy, but a profound cultural and political event. Chroniclers of the era noted the gradual deterioration of a king who once exuded strength. The robust athleticism of his youth gave way to obesity, swollen limbs, and leg ulcers that refused to heal. His mobility became restricted, forcing him to rely on aids to move from chamber to chamber. The powerful figure who had once struck fear into enemies now struggled with the simplest physical task, a living paradox that fascinated and horrified those around him. The medical understanding of the time, rooted in medieval medicine, was woefully inadequate. Physicians applied poultices and ointments, bled him, and administered diets that often worsened his condition. The lack of scientific knowledge meant that the grotesque decay of his body was as much a product of failed treatments as it was of the natural progression of disease. Some modern historians speculate that Henry VIII suffered from type 2 diabetes, compounded by gout, leg ulcers, and obesity-related complications. Others point to injuries sustained from jousting and falls that may have contributed to chronic infections. Whatever the precise causes, the outcome was undeniable, a king trapped in a body that deteriorated before the eyes of his court. Yet even in the midst of this horror, Henry's will remained formidable. Orders continued to be issued, marriages arranged, and political decisions made. The court adapted to his infirmities. Meetings were held in his bedchamber, ceremonies were modified, and attendants became guardians of both his comfort and his image. Courtiers and advisors navigated a delicate balance, showing reverence while privately recoiling at the signs of decay. The spectacle of a monarch rotting alive blurred the lines between authority and vulnerability, creating an atmosphere charged with both fear and fascination. The cultural significance of this decay cannot be overstated. For contemporaries, the image of a powerful king succumbing to the inevitability of death was a lesson in humility and the limits of human control. For modern audiences, it serves as a grim illustration of how physical frailty can intersect with political authority, producing a story that is both horrifying and historically illuminating. The grotesque reality of Henry VIII's body became inseparable from his legacy, transforming him from a figure of raw power into a symbol of human mortality and the fallibility of even the most commanding rulers. Henry's decline also had profound political implications. England's nobility watched with apprehension as the king's health worsened, knowing that succession crises loomed large. The machinery of governance strained under the limitations imposed by his infirmity. Laws and edicts were still enforced, but the king's physical weakness altered the pace and style of decision-making. Diplomats from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire monitored the situation closely, aware that England's preeminent monarch could no longer assert dominance with the vigor he once commanded. The ripples of a decaying king extended far beyond the walls of Hampton Court, shaping the political landscape of Europe. As we trace the final years of King Henry VIII, we encounter a narrative rich with paradox. Here was a man who shaped nations, dictated the lives of thousands, and left an indelible mark on history. Yet he was powerless against the slow betrayal of his own flesh. This is the stark reality behind the bizarre case of the king who rotted alive. It is a story that merges the tangible horrors of disease with the intangible weight of power, ambition, and historical consequence. Through this immersive journey, we will explore every facet of Henry's decline, the medical mysteries that hastened his decay, the daily realities of a court adapting to a dying monarch, and the cultural memory that transformed him into legend. From the blood-stained halls of Hampton Court to the hidden letters and chronicles of his courtiers, every detail reveals the tension between mortality and monarchy. We will confront the unsettling question: what happens when a king rots alive? And in seeking answers, we will gain insight not only into Henry VIII as a man, but into the broader tapestry of Tudor history, where power, mortality, and spectacle collide. By the conclusion of this narrative, you will understand that Henry VIII's story is more than the tale of a decaying king. It is a meditation on the human condition, on the limitations of authority, and on the ways history remembers the grotesque and the magnificent alike. It is a tale of obsession, of mortality, and of the enduring fascination with those who wield power yet cannot escape the ravages of time. This is the story of the rotten king alive, a monarch whose decay continues to captivate our imagination and whose final days remain one of history's most chilling and compelling mysteries. Before the horrifying spectacle of a king rotting alive, Henry VIII was the embodiment of vigor, ambition, and calculated authority. To understand the grotesque irony of his final years, one must first step into the world of his rise as a young prince whose charisma, intelligence, and ruthlessness foreshadowed the paradox of power and mortality that would define his life. Born in 1491 to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the young prince entered a world steeped in Tudor history, a nation recovering from the Wars of the Roses, where dynastic instability lingered like a shadow. Henry VIII grew up acutely aware of the precariousness of power, a lesson imprinted upon him by the constant tension between Yorkist and Lancastrian claims. Educated by the finest tutors of the age, he mastered languages, theology, music, and the art of statecraft. But more than intellectual prowess, he developed a presence, a combination of confidence, athleticism, and personal magnetism that marked him as a ruler in the making, a medieval king whose ambition would reshape England. The young prince was athletic and competitive, excelling in justs, hunting, and tennis, sports that were more than mere recreation. They were exercises in politics, visibility, and reputation. Each victory in the lists or on the field of play bolstered his stature among the court and abroad. His early life reflected a man who understood that monarchy required not just command but spectacle. A king's presence itself was an instrument of power. This mastery over perception would later make the grotesque contrast of his decaying body all the more shocking. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, the country expected stability, yet the young king's ambitions quickly transformed England's political and cultural landscape. He married Catherine of Aragon, securing an alliance with Spain, and immediately began consolidating power over his nobles and advisors. Historical facts show a monarch intent on absolute authority. He reorganized his council, dismissed ineffective ministers, and cultivated loyalty among those who could execute his will. Even at this early stage, Henry's drive for control foreshadowed the ruthless tenacity that would characterize his later rule and, paradoxically, the same traits that magnified the horror of his decline. Henry VIII was not only a ruler, but also a patron of the arts and scholarship. He commissioned elaborate tapestries, grand palaces, and musical compositions, projecting both personal taste and political power. These acts were more than vanity. They were demonstrations of authority, reinforcing his image as a monarch whose reach extended into every corner of English life. He embodied the ideal of a medieval king, a leader who combined military prowess, political intelligence, and cultural sophistication. Yet even in these triumphant early years, the first whispers of vulnerability began to emerge, subtle though easily overlooked. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir was not merely personal, it was a political necessity. The Tudor dynasty, newly established, could not risk instability. Every marriage, every alliance, and every decision regarding succession carried immense weight. In this context, the seeds of Henry's later obsession with control and the extreme measures he would take to preserve his lineage were sown. These ambitions, while consolidating his power, hinted at the human fragility that would later become all too visible in his decaying body. Henry's court reflected both brilliance and terror. Courtiers lived under the scrutiny of a king who could reward loyalty with titles and estates or punish perceived disloyalty with execution. Figures such as Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, and Thomas Cromwell rose to prominence through their ability to navigate the king's expectations, balancing service with survival. Even in these early years, Henry's personality was a mix of charm, intellect, and latent ruthlessness, a combination that made him both respected and feared. These dynamics would only intensify as his body began to fail. While the young king thrived in the arenas of power, his physical health was still robust. Yet historians note that his later ailments may have had roots in this period. Injuries sustained during jousts, his energetic lifestyle, and indulgence in rich foods may have laid the groundwork for the obesity, leg ulcers, and chronic pain that would define his final years. The juxtaposition of this early vitality with the eventual grotesque decay of Henry VIII's final days heightens the tragic irony. A king who once embodied perfection and vigor ultimately became a cautionary tale of human frailty. Henry VIII's rise also coincided with significant religious and political shifts. His break from the Roman Catholic Church to establish the Church of England was motivated in part by personal desire, but also by a sophisticated understanding of political power. By declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, Henry centralized authority, controlling both spiritual and temporal matters. Historical facts reveal a monarch who could wield law, religion, and culture as instruments of governance, a medieval king whose intellect and ambition appeared limitless. Yet no legal decree or religious reform could protect him from the decay that would later consume him. Even as he consolidated power, Henry was a man acutely aware of image. Court masks, tournaments, and elaborate ceremonies were meticulously choreographed to convey strength, vitality, and legitimacy. The young king understood the psychological impact of display. A ruler's body, his comportment, and his presence were as potent as armies in projecting authority. It is this careful cultivation of perception that renders the reality of the king rotting alive so profoundly disturbing. The body that had once been a tool of influence became an object of horror and fascination, a paradox that would shape both contemporary accounts and centuries of legend. By examining the path from prince to monarch, we see the foundation of the tragic arc that defines Henry VIII. His early life and reign established not only his power, but also the expectations placed upon him. A king must be strong, decisive, and above all, enduring. The grotesque spectacle of his decay violates every principle he embodied, creating a tension between authority and vulnerability that captivates historians and the public alike. What happens when a man who has shaped the course of a nation can no longer control the simplest functions of his own body? This question underscores the drama of his final years. The rise of Henry VIII also illuminates the context in which medieval medicine gone wrong. As we move into the story of Henry VIII's body betraying him, we will see how the human vulnerability concealed beneath the crown became impossible to ignore. We will explore the medical failures, courtly adaptations, and historical consequences that transformed Henry VIII from a commanding figure into a cautionary emblem of decay. The rise of the king is the prologue to a tragedy, a reminder that no amount of power or prestige can stave off the relentless progression of mortality. By the late 1530s, the grandeur of King Henry VIII's reign, once defined by vigor, martial skill, and political mastery, had begun to conceal an unavoidable truth. No crown, no title, no authority could halt the relentless march of mortality. The young, athletic prince who had dazzled his court and intimidated Europe's rulers now confronted the frailty of his own flesh. The transition from a vigorous monarch to a king rotting alive was neither sudden nor sensationalized. It was a gradual, horrifying reality meticulously recorded in the whispers of courtiers, the letters of physicians, and the chronicles of historians. By this time, Henry had transformed physically into a man unrecognizable from the prince who had ascended the throne in 1509. Once athletic and imposing, he had grown profoundly obese, a change compounded by years of indulgent diets, sedentary court life, and underlying health conditions. Chronic leg ulcers, some so severe that they festered and refused to heal, became a source of constant torment. These wounds, often inflamed and emitting foul odors, were treated with the rudimentary methods of medieval medicine gone wrong. Poultices of herbs, repeated bleeding, and poultices laced with vinegar or honey intended to disinfect, but often accelerating infection. Physicians were powerless to halt the deterioration, trapped in a system of limited understanding and deeply flawed medical practices. Some modern scholars suggest that Henry suffered from diabetes, complicated by gout, vascular disease, and repeated injuries sustained during jousts. This combination of ailments would explain not only the visible decay, swollen limbs, discolored flesh, and malodorous ulcers, but also the internal suffering, fatigue, cognitive decline, and chronic pain. Contemporary accounts from courtiers describe a king whose appearance was startling, a bloated, immobile figure whose dignity and aura of authority were challenged by the grotesque evidence of his physical decline. Yet despite this, Henry's mind remained sharp, his orders exacting, and his will unbowed, a terrifying paradox of life and decay intertwined. The psychological and political effects of this physical transformation were profound. Courtiers approached him cautiously, blending reverence with fear. Advisors who had once been confident in the king's energy and decisiveness now tiptoed through his chambers, aware that any misstep, whether in etiquette or counsel, could provoke anger, embarrassment, or reprisal. The body that had once inspired awe now inspired horror, and the court adapted to maintain a delicate balance between obedience and the human instinct to recoil from the stench and sight of decay. Daily life became a theater of adaptation. The king could no longer walk unassisted, necessitating elaborate arrangements of chairs, cushions, and support from attendants. Council meetings and audiences were shifted to his bedchamber, where the grotesque reality of his decay could be managed away from the public eye. Royal death protocols, designed to preserve the dignity of the monarch, collided with the practicalities of a king whose final days were marked by ulcerations, infections, and chronic pain. Ceremonial procedures, once a display of regal magnificence, had to be modified, illustrating the profound tension between tradition, authority, and the limitations of the human body. Even as the body deteriorated, the king's political influence persisted. He continued to command armies, arrange marriages, enforce laws, and issue decrees. This duality, mind intact, body failing, produced a bizarre and haunting spectacle. A king exercising power through the agency of a body that no longer obeyed him. Historians describe the paradox in chilling detail. Henry's decrees continued to shape England, yet every step, every movement, every breath was a reminder that even supreme authority could not shield him from decay. The grotesque nature of his decline also shaped contemporary understanding of mortality and divine providence. In an age where monarchs were often idealized as near-divine figures, the spectacle of Henry VIII rotting alive provoked fear and fascination in equal measure. It challenged perceptions of kingship. If a king could succumb so visibly to disease, what did that say about power, fate, and the human condition? Chroniclers wrestled with these questions, producing texts that combined historical record with moral and theological reflection, ensuring that the tale of the decaying king would resonate long beyond his death. Henry's suffering also highlighted the limits of medieval medicine. Physicians attempted to treat the king's ulcers with topical applications, dietary regimens, and experimental concoctions. They applied honey, vinegar, and herbal pastes to wounds. They advised rest and moderation. They performed bloodletting and purges intended to balance the humors. Yet all interventions failed to halt the progression of infection and gangrene. Modern medical analysis suggests that these treatments, though standard for the period, likely exacerbated the wounds, accelerating the process that would make Henry VIII one of history's most notorious examples of a king rotting alive. Psychologically, Henry's transformation was a crucible of endurance and ego. Despite the constant pain, he maintained control over the machinery of state, demonstrating a combination of stubbornness and intellect that amplified the tragedy of his condition. Advisors recorded his irritability and sudden outbursts, perhaps amplified by chronic discomfort and systemic illness. Yet these records also reveal a mind that remained strategic, aware, and politically potent. Even as his flesh decayed, the king's willpower projected authority over life and death within his realm. This period also profoundly impacted the court. The courtiers learned to navigate fear, respect, and the grotesque spectacle of their ruler's decline. Daily rituals feeding, dressing, and moving the king became ceremonies of survival, blending etiquette with practical care. Any misstep could be interpreted as disrespect, but failure to maintain proximity could result in loss of influence or favor. The spectacle of a king rotting alive thus became a stage where politics, survival, and mortality intertwined in ways both subtle and overt. Beyond the court, the effects radiated throughout England. Nobles, foreign diplomats, and the general populace were all aware that England's supreme authority had been physically compromised. The king's weakened state influenced treaties, succession considerations, and alliances. Even as Henry issued decrees and managed policy, the awareness of his decaying body added an undercurrent of instability to the governance of the nation, illustrating that the fragility of one man's flesh could ripple across the course of history. Henry VIII's decline is more than a tale of bodily deterioration. It is an intersection of Tudor history, political strategy, and medical failure. His ulcers, infections, obesity, and possible diabetes transformed from private suffering into a spectacle that defined his final. The grotesque reality of Henry VIII's final days also invites reflection on the nature of historical narrative. Chroniclers struggled to balance truth and decorum, often blending factual accounts with moralized interpretations. Letters, diaries, and official documents provide glimpses into the horror of his condition. Yet the story has also been shaped by centuries of retelling, exaggeration, and myth-making. This intersection of reality and legend amplifies the fascination with the rotten king alive, making him a figure who embodies both historical fact and cultural imagination. In sum, the king's body betrayed him in every visible way. Ulcers festered, limbs swelled, flesh decayed, and yet, the monarch continued to command the machinery of the state. The paradox of Henry VIII, a ruler whose mind wielded supreme authority while his body succumbed to relentless decay, ensures that his story endures as one of the most compelling in Tudor history. It is a narrative that intertwines political mastery, human frailty, medical failure, and cultural fascination, producing a cautionary tale whose resonance persists centuries later. While the body of King Henry VIII betrayed him, his authority demanded absolute obedience. The once vibrant halls of Hampton Court had transformed into a theater of both awe and horror. Courtiers moved with trepidation, advisors tread lightly, and servants undertook intricate maneuvers to maintain appearances, all under the watchful eyes of a king whose flesh decayed even as he sat upon the throne. This was not merely the spectacle of a ruler losing health. It was the daily reality of the bizarre case of the king rotting alive, a monarch whose physical decline shaped the culture, politics, and psychology of the Tudor court. Henry's personal suffering became inseparable from governance. Decisions that once flowed swiftly from the king's command now faced delays, constrained by pain, immobility, and medical interventions. Even medieval kings were not immune to the consequences of physical deterioration, and every ulcer, swelling, and chronic wound subtly influenced the machinery of state. Courtiers understood that policy and power were entwined with the king's body. The grotesque nature of his ailments, a swollen frame, festering ulcers, and foul odors forced adaptations in both ceremony and practical governance. His decrepit body became a shadow authority, as palpable and influential as any edict he issued. Chroniclers of the era provide vivid, often chilling descriptions. They recount a monarch who could not walk unassisted, whose presence required cushions, chairs, and attendants to support him. The corridors of Hampton Court were arranged to accommodate his mobility, while council meetings and state affairs were relocated to his bedchamber, a space that blurred the boundary between private suffering and public duty. Physicians, constrained by the limitations of medieval medicine gone wrong, attempted treatments that ranged from poultices and topical remedies to bloodletting, yet none could halt the relentless progression of infection. The king's body, once a symbol of vitality and control, had become a paradox, simultaneously commanding and dependent, feared and pitied. Daily life at court was a delicate choreography. Servants and attendants learned to navigate both etiquette and hygiene, balancing respect for royal dignity with the practical necessity of attending to an incapacitated monarch. Feeding, dressing, and moving Henry became elaborate state rituals. Courtiers observed him, attuned to every movement, every sign of discomfort, aware that a single misstep could provoke his wrath or undermine their standing. The spectacle of a king rotting alive was no mere rumor. It was an operational reality, influencing the behavior and psychology of all who served him. Despite the horrors of his physical decline, Henry's political mind remained formidable. He continued to manage alliances, arrange marriages, and enforce laws. Even from his bedchamber, The king exercised authority that affected not only his court but the entire realm. This duality, a body failing even as the mind commanded, was a stark demonstration of power coexisting with vulnerability, a reminder that historical facts often challenge perception. In Henry's case, the contrast between mind and flesh magnified the fascination surrounding his final years, producing a narrative that blends governance, pathology, and spectacle. The king's decline had direct implications for diplomacy and international relations. Foreign powers, observing England's supreme authority compromised by visible frailty, adjusted their negotiations and strategies. Ambassadors reported back with a mixture of concern and opportunism, aware that the physical limitations of the monarch could create openings for political maneuvering. The decaying king, paradoxically, became both a symbol of enduring power and a figure whose mortality could destabilize alliances and influence outcomes. Within the court, the grotesque reality of Henry's decline created an atmosphere of fear, awe, and morbidity. Courtiers whispered behind screens, debated loyalties, and speculated on succession, all while performing the intricate dances of etiquette required by a monarch who could still enforce punishment but whose body betrayed him. The presence of the rotten king alive shaped behavior, strategy, and relationships in ways subtle yet profound, a daily reminder of the intersection between human frailty and absolute authority. The king's medical condition also intersected with cultural expectations. Medieval kings were expected to embody strength, vitality, and divine favor. The sight of Henry, bloated, ulcerated, and malodorous, confronted courtiers and observers with a moral and theological paradox. How could a divinely sanctioned ruler appear so physically corrupted? Chroniclers and physicians grappled with these contradictions, documenting not only the king's ailments, but also the cultural and moral narratives that arose from his decline. The spectacle became a meditation on the limits of human power, the inevitability of decay, and the fragility of authority. Henry's final years also reveal the psychological dimensions of ruling while incapacitated. His decrees continued, yet their implementation depended increasingly on intermediaries, advisors, clerks, and courtiers capable of translating the king's commands into action. The decaying monarch thus reshaped governance itself. Power became increasingly mediated, filtered through the court, and dependent on the cooperation of those who both feared and revered him. The grotesque spectacle of his body underscored the tension between appearance and authority, visibility and influence, mortality and legacy. The interplay between decay and political power extended to succession. The king's physical state intensified the urgency surrounding the question of heirs. Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and later his son Edward, were central to courtly calculations of legitimacy, alliances, and the stability of the realm. Advisors navigated these issues with extraordinary caution, knowing that missteps in the king's presence or in his absence could provoke a crisis. The decaying king, paradoxically, magnified the stakes of governance. Mortality became a central political actor, and the king's body dictated the tempo of history. Even ceremonial life adapted to the grotesque reality. State functions, religious observances, and the grotesque realities of Henry's decay underscore a paradox central to historical mysteries of royal deaths. The more absolute the authority, the more vivid the contrast when the body fails. Henry VIII's court adapted, performed, and endured under the shadow of mortality, blending fear, respect, and pragmatism. The king's body dictated the flow of power, the behavior of courtiers, and even the pace of international politics, creating a living tableau of authority intertwined with vulnerability. In reflecting on this period, one recognizes that the story of Henry VIII's court is as much about human adaptability and the social management of decay as it is about the individual monarch. The grotesque spectacle of the king's body, the meticulous rituals that attended him, and the political adaptations that emerged provide insight into the fragile balance between life, death, and power. The narrative of the decaying monarch reminds us that historical facts, even those steeped in horror, illuminate the resilience, ingenuity, and cultural values of the people who lived alongside him. The court of Henry VIII, once a symbol of vibrancy and magnificence, had become a stage where decay and authority coexisted, where the grotesque and the regal intersected daily. The story of these final years demonstrates that power is inseparable from the human body that wields it, and that even the most formidable medieval kings are ultimately subject to the limitations imposed by flesh and mortality. What happens when a king rots alive? In the court of Henry VIII, the answer was a complex tapestry of fear, adaptation, awe, and unyielding political influence, a theater of human vulnerability staged within the halls of history itself. The grotesque reality of King Henry VIII rotting alive was not confined to the private chambers of Hampton Court. It reverberated throughout the kingdom, reshaping the political, social, and international landscape of Tudor England. The decline of the monarch's body introduced a new variable into governance, one that no political maneuvering could control. Authority, once exercised effortlessly, now had to contend with the undeniable evidence of human frailty, a spectacle that both courtiers and foreign powers observed with fear, fascination, and strategic calculation. As Henry's physical ailments worsened, questions surrounding succession became increasingly urgent. The king had spent decades obsessed with producing a male heir, and the political implications of his failing health brought the matter into stark relief. England's nobility, who had long relied on the certainty of royal command, now faced a precarious landscape. Advisors carefully measured every word, weighing loyalty against opportunity, aware that miscalculations could provoke both scandal and bloodshed. Chroniclers note that the atmosphere in court was one of tension and unease, where every gesture and statement was scrutinized, and where the king's decaying body served as a silent arbiter of influence. The decay of Henry VIII's flesh had profound implications for royal death protocols. Ceremonial traditions designed to uphold the dignity of monarchy confronted the practical reality of a king who could no longer stand, move, or present himself in the majesty demanded by Tudor custom. Foul odors and festering wounds complicated the staging of public appearances, and even intimate audiences required meticulous planning. The spectacle of a king rotting alive forced adaptations that challenged centuries of ritual, revealing the fragile interplay between human biology and political theater. Beyond England's borders, Henry's condition sent ripples through international diplomacy. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire monitored the king's health with keen interest. The perception of England's leadership, weakened by the visibility of royal decay, influenced negotiations, alliances, and military strategies. Foreign powers understood that the frailty of the monarch might create openings for influence or territorial advantage, making Henry's body a silent, yet potent, actor on the European stage. The paradox of enduring authority paired with visible physical decline became a diplomatic reality that reshaped foreign relations and underscored the centrality of human frailty in historical outcomes. Within the court itself, the king's decrepit state recalibrated power dynamics. Advisors and ministers assumed roles that extended beyond traditional counsel, often mediating the execution of policy when Henry's physical limitations impeded direct oversight. Decisions that might once have been immediate now required negotiation, delegation, and constant vigilance. The grotesque spectacle of the monarch's body elevated courtiers' influence, yet also imposed the ever-present risk of misjudgment. One wrong move could provoke anger, embarrassment, or reprisal, illustrating the delicate balance of fear and loyalty that defined life under the rotten king alive. Henry's decaying body also reshaped the perception of authority within the kingdom. For centuries, kings had been regarded as near-divine figures, embodying vigor, moral integrity, and cosmic favor. The sight of the obese, ulcerated, and foul-smelling monarch challenged these assumptions, forcing observers to reconcile the idealized image of kingship with the harsh realities of mortality. The king's decline became a lens through which subjects, nobles, and historians alike could reflect on the limitations of power, the inevitability of death, and the human susceptibility that no crown could mask. Succession, already a sensitive issue, became a crucible for both. Even in the shadow of mortality, the king's influence persisted. Religious reforms, legal codifications, and military campaigns continued under his decrepit hand, illustrating the paradox of authority entwined with vulnerability. The story of Henry VIII's decline is therefore not only a tale of medical horror, but a study of resilience, adaptation, and the complex interdependencies between body, mind, and governance. Ultimately, the political ripples of a rotting king reveal the inseparability of human frailty and historical consequence. The decline of Henry VIII's body transformed courtly behavior, succession planning, diplomacy, ceremonial practice, and governance itself. The grotesque spectacle of the rotten king alive serves as a vivid illustration of the fragility of power when confronted with the inevitable decay of the human body. Tudor history is punctuated not only by battles, laws, and marriages, but also by the stark, haunting reminder that mortality shapes history as much as ambition, intellect, or weaponry. In conclusion, the decay of Henry VIII produced consequences far beyond his own suffering. The monarchy, the court, the succession, and international diplomacy were all influenced by the king's failing body, revealing that the spectacle of a monarch rotting alive was not merely a private tragedy. It was a public, political, and cultural phenomenon. The interplay of flesh, power, and historical narrative in this period created a tableau of human vulnerability that continues to captivate historians and audiences alike. Henry VIII's grotesque decline became a lens through which we examine authority, mortality, and the enduring mysteries surrounding royal deaths, reminding us that even the mightiest rulers are ultimately subject to the inexorable forces of biology and time. As the decades passed, the grotesque reality of King Henry VIII's final days transformed into legend. The tale of a monarch rotting alive at the height of his power became more than an ahistorical fact. It became a story amplified and reshaped by chroniclers, playwrights, and historians, embedding itself into the collective imagination of England and beyond. The man who had once redefined Tudor history, enforcing religious reform, waging war, and commanding obedience with absolute authority, became larger than life, a figure whose decaying flesh mirrored the dramatic transformations of the kingdom he ruled. The historical facts of Henry's suffering are striking: extreme obesity, festering leg ulcers, possible diabetes, gout, and infections that defied the rudimentary treatments of the era. Yet the cultural memory of these events often exaggerated or dramatized these horrors, producing the mythos of the rotten king alive. Chroniclers painted a vivid image of the monarch, blending observation with moral judgment, interpreting bodily decay as a metaphor for spiritual or political failings. The spectacle of the king's suffering thus became both a literal and symbolic cautionary tale. This transformation of fact into legend is visible across literature, theater, and visual art. Tudor pamphlets and satires circulated tales of Henry's bloated and decayed body, often highlighting the grotesque in ways that entertained, educated, and admonished simultaneously. Playwrights in the centuries following his death leveraged these accounts, constructing narratives in which the decay of the king served as a moral lesson about pride, ambition, and the fragility of human power. Even today, modern historians, filmmakers, and YouTubers revisit these depictions, blending the factual horrors of his final years with cultural imagination to create compelling narratives that continue to fascinate audiences. The interplay between myth and historical reality raises essential questions. What happens when a king rots alive? In the case of Henry VIII, the answer is not solely medical or political, it is cultural. His decaying body became a mirror for the anxieties, expectations, and obsessions of Tudor England. Kings were supposed to embody strength, divine favor, and perfection. The grotesque deterioration of Henry's body violated these assumptions, producing cognitive dissonance that society resolved by embedding moral and cultural meaning into his decline. The rotten king alive thus became both a historical reality and a cultural symbol, blurring the lines between life, legend, and the lessons drawn from history. Artists, writers, and historians have long grappled with this paradox. Portraits of Henry in his later years, though often idealized, could not entirely erase the public awareness of his ailments. Chroniclers, from court scribes to foreign observers, documented the decay in ways that emphasized spectacle and morality, weaving the king's decline into the larger tapestry of Tudor history. Literary accounts and visual depictions exaggerated grotesque features, emphasizing the horror, repulsion, and fascination of observers who bore witness to a monarch rotting alive. Through these retellings, the king became a lens through which society could explore excess, mortality, and the limits of authority. The mythos surrounding Henry VIII also played a role in the development of the historical mysteries of royal deaths. Scholars have debated the exact nature of his ailments. Some argue for diabetes, others point to chronic leg ulcers compounded by obesity and poor circulation. Still others suggest genetic factors and lifestyle contributed to his decline. What is indisputable is that his final years presented a spectacularly grotesque tableau, one that invited interpretation, embellishment, and moral reflection. The fusion of medical reality with cultural narrative created a story whose impact transcended biography, offering enduring lessons on the fragility of power. Cultural fascination with the rotten king alive extends to modern times. Documentaries, YouTube videos, and historical podcasts revisit these events with a mixture of shock, empathy, and analysis. Audiences are drawn not only to the gruesome facts, but also to the symbolic resonance of the king's decline. The story functions as a lens to examine the intersections of authority, excess, and human vulnerability. It also prompts reflection on how societies interpret mortality in rulers, the spectacle of decay, particularly when visible in public or semi-public life, transforms history into narrative, blending human tragedy with cultural myth-making. Even as myth amplified his grotesque decay, Henry VIII's life and rule continued to influence culture, politics, and historical interpretation. The legacy of his final days intersects with broader themes in Tudor history: the consolidation of power, religious reform, succession crises, and the centralization of state authority. The king's physical decline did not erase these achievements, but it did color their perception, intertwining accomplishment with cautionary spectacle. In literature, chronicles, and modern historical media, the rotten king alive serves as both a dramatic centerpiece and a prism for understanding the complex interplay of biology, authority, and narrative. The legend also functions as a moral narrative. Henry VIII's physical excesses, his indulgence in food, drink, and physical pleasure, were often framed as contributing factors to his decline. Chroniclers emphasized the symbolic weight of gluttony, ambition, and tyranny, casting the decaying monarch as a lesson in the consequences of human indulgence. These interpretations reflect a broader cultural engagement with the body as a site of morality, power, and social meaning. By situating decay within moral and political contexts, the myth of the rotten king alive extends beyond individual pathology to encompass cultural, historical, and philosophical reflection. At the intersection of myth and history lies the challenge of interpretation. How much of Henry's decline was observed and documented accurately, and how much was shaped by the imaginations of chroniclers, historians, and artists? The historical mysteries of royal deaths lie not only in medical uncertainty, but in the way society reconstructs narrative from observation. Accounts of odor, festering wounds, and physical immobility were magnified to produce tales that entertained, instructed, and shocked simultaneously. The result is a story that is simultaneously factual, interpretive, and symbolic, a complex legacy that continues to captivate audiences across centuries. Modern fascination with Henry's decline also intersects with medical history. Retrospective diagnoses of obesity-related complications, infections, and metabolic disorders provide insight into the limitations of medieval medicine gone wrong. Scholars and enthusiasts alike examine how physicians' limited understanding, coupled with courtly excess, contributed to the prolonged suffering of a monarch whose body became a public symbol of vulnerability. In this context, The Rotten King Alive serves as a case study in the convergence of biology, culture, and governance, highlighting how physical decline can reverberate through politics, society, and historical memory. Ultimately, the legend of Henry VIII as the Rotten King Alive endures because it embodies the intersection of power and mortality. His final years offer a vivid illustration of how human frailty shapes history, how culture transforms observation into myth, and how authority is continuously negotiated in the presence of visible vulnerability. The king's grotesque decline, recorded in historical facts and amplified through centuries of retelling, illuminates how society interprets, narrates, and mythologizes the death and decay of rulers. The Rotten King Alive is more than a tale of morbidity. It is a lens through which we examine the fragile foundations of power, the symbolic weight of the body in historical narrative, and the ways culture preserves, interprets, and transforms the events of life and death into enduring lessons. From the chronicles of courtiers to the analytical narratives of modern historians, Henry VIII's grotesque final years continue to inspire fascination, fear, and reflection, a reminder that even the mightiest rulers are subject to the inexorable forces of decay and mortality. Through this myth, the grotesque spectacle of the king becomes timeless, a story of what happens when a king rots alive that resonates with human curiosity about mortality, excess, and the fragility of authority. Henry's body, once a site of absolute power, now occupies a place in both history and legend, embodying the tensions between reality and interpretation, mortality and legacy, human suffering and cultural imagination. The reign of King Henry VIII was defined by spectacle, ambition, and transformation, yet it is the grotesque and shocking final years, the period in which his body deteriorated while his authority lingered, that have captured the fascination of historians, artists, and the public alike. The image of the monarch rotting alive endures as one of the most haunting symbols of human frailty intersecting with supreme power. It is not merely a story of morbidity. It is a study in contrasts, the invincible ruler undone by the inescapable vulnerabilities of the human body. Henry VIII's physical decline in the late 1530s and 1540s marked a profound moment in Tudor history. Once athletic, charismatic, and commanding, the king had transformed into a figure whose mobility was severely limited, whose wounds festered, and whose very presence evoked both fear and revulsion. Chroniclers of the era describe swollen limbs, ulcers that refused to heal, and the noxious odors that accompanied advanced decay. Yet, even in the midst of this grotesque transformation, his mind remained formidable. Orders were issued, marriages arranged, religious reforms enforced, and laws enacted, an unyielding assertion of power by a body in rebellion. The paradox of a ruler exerting influence while rotting alive speaks to the enduring complexity of historical authority and the resilience of political structures amidst personal catastrophe. The cultural memory of Henry VIII as the rotten king alive extends far beyond the specifics of his ailments. The king became a symbol of the tension between ambition and mortality, power and human vulnerability. Chroniclers, artists, and later historians framed his decay as a cautionary tale of excess, indulgence, and the consequences of unchecked desire. His legendary gluttony, opulent lifestyle, and ruthless pursuit of authority were interpreted as factors that accelerated the physical decline of a man once deemed nearly untouchable. The narrative of what happens when a king rots alive thus became intertwined with moral, cultural, and historical commentary, shaping perceptions of leadership and legacy for generations. Even the historical mysteries of royal deaths are inseparable from Henry's grotesque decline. Scholars debate the precise causes: obesity, diabetes, infections, ulcerated legs, gout, and possibly genetic factors all likely contributed to his suffering. Modern medical analysis, juxtaposed with contemporary accounts, reveals both the limitations of medieval medicine gone wrong and the cultural fascination with bodily decay in rulers. The rotten king alive thus becomes a prism through which we understand not only Tudor political history, but also the evolution of medical knowledge, cultural perception, and narrative construction over time. The spectacle of the decaying king influenced the court profoundly. Courtiers navigated a delicate balance between obedience and revulsion, mediating between a monarch whose authority remained absolute and a body that signaled vulnerability. Decisions that once flowed directly from the king now required interpretation, adaptation, and negotiation. Advisors became essential conduits between a deteriorating body and the machinery of governance, revealing how personal health could shape political power. The grotesque reality of a ruler rotting alive redefined social hierarchies, the exercise of influence, and the conduct of daily governance within the Tudor court. Internationally, Henry VIII's condition reverberated through diplomacy. Foreign powers scrutinized the kingdom with renewed interest, aware that England's formidable ruler was visibly compromised. Treaties, alliances, and military strategies were all influenced by knowledge or rumor of the king's declining health. The paradox of enduring authority coupled with physical decay made Henry VIII a figure of both intimidation and vulnerability. His grotesque decline became a factor in European power dynamics, illustrating how human frailty could alter not only domestic but also international politics. The cultural resonance of the rotten king alive also finds expression in art, literature, and historiography. Satirical pamphlets, plays, and later historical narratives depicted Henry as a cautionary figure, emphasizing the grotesque while weaving moral and political lessons into the story of his decay. These retellings magnified his suffering, blending fact with interpretation to produce enduring myths. Yet, beneath the sensationalism lies a profound reflection on mortality, authority, and the social construction of power, an exploration of how a ruler's body can become a vessel for collective fear, fascination, and moral contemplation. Even in death, the legacy of decay shaped historical perception. The historical facts of Henry's final days, combined with the legend of his grotesque condition, influenced how subsequent monarchs were portrayed, how royal ceremonies were conducted, and how chroniclers approached accounts of mortality among the elite. The spectacle of a king rotting alive forced society to confront uncomfortable truths, that even the most powerful individuals are subject to the inevitability of death, and that the cultural and political impact of a ruler's decline can be as significant as their achievements in life. Henry VIII's story also serves as a lens through which we examine the intersection of medicine, morality, and monarchy. The failures of contemporary physicians, coupled with the king's indulgences, provide insight into the limitations of medical understanding in Tudor England. Chroniclers and historians interpreted these failures as more than technical inadequacies. They became embedded in moral and cultural narratives, portraying decay as both a biological reality and a symbolic lesson. The Rotten King Alive embodies this duality, a literal case study of human frailty and a metaphorical reflection on excess, pride, and impermanence. The enduring fascination with Henry VIII's grotesque final years is evident in modern media. Documentaries, YouTube narratives, and historical fiction explore the king's life and decay with a mixture of horror, empathy, and analytical insight. Audiences are captivated by the intersection of power, mortality, and spectacle, with the visceral evidence of bodily decline against the backdrop of a once mighty monarchy. The story of what happens when a king rots alive resonates because it humanizes a figure often mythologized for his authority, revealing that even history's most formidable rulers were not immune to the ultimate arbiter, mortality. The final days of Henry VIII, therefore, are both a medical and cultural case study. They reveal the fragility of political authority in the presence of human vulnerability, the limitations of contemporary medicine, and the ways society constructs and perpetuates myth. The grotesque spectacle of the king's decay intersects with Tudor history, international diplomacy, courtly power dynamics, and cultural narrative, making it one of the most compelling and multifaceted episodes in the study of monarchy. Moreover, The Rotten King Alive challenges contemporary perceptions of leadership and mortality. His story underscores that authority is not solely derived from intellect, charisma, or military might. It is inextricably linked to physical presence, perception, and the societal expectations surrounding the human body. The grotesque decay of Henry VIII demonstrates that when the human body fails, even the highest power must contend with new vulnerabilities, reshaping governance, diplomacy, and culture in ways that echo across centuries. In conclusion, the legacy of King Henry VIII as the Rotten King Alive extends far beyond the literal horror of his physical decay. It encompasses the cultural imagination, moral narrative, political consequence, and historical memory. His final days serve as a reminder that mortality is the ultimate equalizer, that even the most commanding rulers are subject to biological limits, and that history is shaped as much by human vulnerability as by ambition and power. The grotesque spectacle of Henry VIII's decline is thus both a medical phenomenon and a cultural lens, illuminating the enduring fascination with what happens when a king rots alive and leaving an indelible mark on the historical mysteries of royal deaths. The Rotten King Alive remains a haunting figure, a vivid testament to the extremes of human ambition, vulnerability, and the complex interplay between power, mortality, and legacy. Through his story, audiences gain not only insight into Tudor history, but also an enduring meditation on the limitations of authority, the persistence of cultural memory, and the fascination with decay that continues to captivate centuries later.